Dzień dobry Państwu. Dzień dobry Państwu. Witam Państwa serdecznie na spotkaniu z profesorem Larrym Wolffem, autorem książki Wynalezienie Europy Wschodniej. Halo, halo. Jestem słyszalny. Witam Państwa serdecznie. Proszę nam wybaczyć kłopoty techniczne. Jest to mój pierwszy występ w takich warunkach, w tej roli. Także może się okazać, że będziemy mieli jakieś kłopoty. Miejmy nadzieję, że nie, ale jeżeli będą, to bardzo Was serdecznie proszę o wyrozumiałość. I nasze spotkanie w większości będzie po angielsku. I z wyjątkiem prezentacji, którą, jak Pan Profesor mówi, która będzie w większości po polsku. Hello, Larry. It's an honor to have you here. Professor Larry Wolff is an author of a book, Inventing Eastern Europe, which was published in, I think, 1994. And it's still one of the most important books written about Eastern Europe. It's about our image. Well, I will, and we'll talk about this we are going to talk about this book for an hour. What we are going to do is Professor Larry is going to show us a presentation in Polish, as he said, about his book. It's going to take about 10 minutes. And then we'll have a short discussion, about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. And of course, we welcome questions from the audience. You can ask questions on chat on your right side, at least on my screen, it's on the right side, so you can ask questions both in Polish and English, and I'm going to translate them. So, Larry, let's start from your presentation. And again, let me say it's one of the most important books I have read about Eastern Europe, and it's still in probably top 5 most impactful and significant books written about our region in the West in the last 30 years or so. So let's start from the presentation. I'm going to disappear for a short moment. Agnieszko, please, proszę pokaż nam prezentację.
Thank you very much, Adam. Bardzo dziękuję. It's a great honor for me. Jest dla mnie wielki zaszczyt, że moja książka tłumaczona była po polsku. Żałuję z całego serca, że nie mogę być tam osobiście w Polsce, ale tylko wirtualnie teraz. Zaczynam z książki dla dzieci z mojego dzieciństwa. Od lat 60., 50 lat temu, bo ja byłem dzieckiem zimnej wojny. Ta książka, Poznanie Europy Wschodniej, temat ważny podczas zimnej wojny. Wydawało się, że łatwo było to poznać. Europa Wschodnia to był Europa komunistyczna. Nawet dziecko mogło wiedzieć, gdzie był Europa Wschodnia. Ten chłopak to nie ja, ale mógł być. Przede wszystkim był wyraźnie oddzielony od Europy Zachodniej. Ale czy to był coś naturalnego, coś historycznego, coś wiecznego? Byłem zdumiony, kiedy znalazłem ten grawer, ten obraz w XVIII wieku. Mapa ogólna, carte general, Francja, imperium, to jest Niemcy, z jednej strony, i z drugiej strony Polska i Rosja razem. Francja i Niemcy jak bliźniaki, dwie boginie. Polska i Rosja jak bliźniaki, dwa prymitywy. Proszę obserwować, mała karta geograficzna powyżej i cherubiny tylko na zachodzie. Europa wyraźnie oddzielona w XVIII wieku, jakby to był już wiek zimnej wojny. Nie zawsze tak było. Europa oddzielona wschód i zachód. W starożytnym świecie Rzymian, do wieku renesansu, Europa była pomyślana jako podzielona północ i południe. Podzielone przez Alpy. To naturalne, to topograficzne. Tylko w XVIII wieku wydarzyło nowe idee Europy, Zachód i Wschód. I to jest tematem mojej książki, Wynalezienie Europy Wschodniej. Jak to się stało, ta nowa orientacja kontynentu. Podróżnik jako Comte de Ségur, który podróżował od Paryża do Sankt Petersburgu w XVIII wieku, pisał, że wjechać do Polski, myślisz, że całkowicie opuściłeś Europę. Coś absurdu. Jego wrażenie, jego poczucie wyobcowania, krajobraz, zwyczaje, kostiumy, wszystko stworzył dla Francuza dziwna fantazja geograficzna. Podróżnik jako angielski, Józef Marszał w Rosji, gdzie zauważał kara cielesna jako dowód okrucieństwa despotyzmu. Pewno, że kara cielesna istniał też w Anglii w XVIII wieku, ale w Europie Wschodniej bicie stało się dowodem różnicy kontynentalnej. Kiedy Mozart zrobił krótką podróż od Wiednia do Pragi, podróż w kierunku nieco zachodnim, dla przedstawienia Figaro w Pradze, usłyszał język słowiański, język czeski, który nie rozumiał i czuł się w innym świecie i zaraz wymyślał nowe imiona dla całej rodziny. Imiona komiczne, fantastyczne, orientalne. Wielki Voltaire, który nigdy nie podróżował do Europy Wschodniej, napisał list do cesarzowej Katarzyny w Sankt Petersburgu o jej wojnie z Turkami. I Voltaire wyobrażał się cały region międzynarodowy z Gdańska aż do Morza Czarne jako nowa Europa Wschodnia, Polska, Rosja, Turcja, wszystkie razem. I wielki Rousseau, który też nigdy nie podróżował do Europy Wschodniej, ale zainteresował się Rzeczpospolita Polska w dobie rozbiorów i wyobrażał się możliwość nowoczesnej polskiej narodowości. Wyobrażał się Europę Wschodnią jako laboratorium do produkcji nowoczesnych narodów. I wreszcie niemiecki filozof Herder, który wyobrażał się, tak jak Voltaire, ogromny region Europy Wschodniej, ale zjednoczony etnograficznie, jako region ludów słowiańskich, region folklorystyczny. Europa Wschodnia mojego dzieciństwa była też regionem folklorystycznym. Dzieci w strojach, nie patrząc na fabrykę feodalną. I koniec komunizmu w tej książce też wyobrażone dla dzieci jako zwycięstwo folklorystyczne, jako fantazja folklorystyczna, happy ending, szczęśliwe zakończenie. W rzeczywistości było inaczej. W Berlinie, w Warszawie z okrągłym stołem, w całej Polsce inna fantazja Hollywood. Ale wreszcie pojawiła się nowa Europa, zjednoczona instytucjonalnie przez Unię Europejską, nawet jeśli uprzedzenia i nierozumienia utrzymują się w nowym wieku. Ale Polska i Litwa wyraźnie w Europie. Zespół litewski Inkultu ma hasło na nowy wiek. Get up and dance to our Eastern European kind of funk. Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Larry. And well, what I would like to ask you at the beginning is, you describe Eastern Europe as a place, created, invented place, which has a certain image problem, let's say. So it's described by the Western observers as a savage place, as a barbaric place, as a place outside of borders of civilization, full of violence, authoritarian, full of bigotry. So this is actually a very, unflattering picture. And my first question is: do you think it's still true today to some extent? I mean, you have I read descriptions of what's happening right now in Eastern Europe in the Western media. You can still do you still see the parts of this image? I mean, we have these autocrats in Orban in Hungary, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, and do you think that the attitude, the Western attitude, is still somehow influenced by what they've seen in the 18th century?
So that's a great question to start with. Thank you, Adam. I would say, first of all, to go back to what you said at the beginning, the unflattering picture. It's not entirely an unflattering picture, I would say. There are unflattering aspects to it, and you could see it in the travelers' pictures that I showed of Sigur and Marshall, the Russian whipping Poland like Asia. But if you were to look at Rousseau and Herder, you would be seeing something different. You would see people who found something that they valued in Eastern Europe also. So I would put the emphasis more on difference than strictly negative in thinking about Eastern Europe in the 18th century. And I would say probably the same thing about the late 20th century and the early 21st century. There is a certain negative tradition of cultural thinking about Eastern Europe that one could trace not just with respect to the governments of Hungary and Poland, although this week that has been very striking, right, in the discussion about the European Recovery Fund, but also more broadly, a set of cultural prejudices that have come into play around issues of immigration and free movement in the European Union. But I would also say, on the whole, the larger development since the end of the Cold War has been a positive embrace, right, that has gone both ways between East and West, even though there are certain negative prejudices, I think, running both ways, East and West, on both sides, and that have made full understanding difficult. But full understanding is always difficult in political life and international relations, don't you think?
Yeah, you're right, I think. But the question, and another question I wanted to ask is, do you think that this unflattering picture, this negative, it was tinted negative, I think, still, do you think it was completely, it was a complete invention? It was, there was no real, factual base to it?
No.
We had serfdom, for example, and it was true. It's not. It was not something that was invented by Western travelers,
Well, it's true that you have serfdom in Poland and in Russia, and it's true that that serfdom existed on very harsh terms in the 18th century. It's also true that there was serfdom in Western Europe as well in the 18th century, including in France, right up until the French Revolution in 1789 and the renunciation of feudal privileges. So what we would be questioning is whether the terms of serfdom were more harsh in Poland and Russia than they were in France, and that's probably true. And what we would say here is that the travelers are looking I would say not so much for evidence of savagery and barbarism, though that's some of the vocabulary that they use, but they're looking for what we would think of as a modern language of backwardness, and they don't have it yet. It's what they're grasping towards. What I think is false, and that is to say, they say true things, the travelers especially. They travel, they see with their own eyes, they're kind of brave, they write about what they see. The thing that's false about the idea of Eastern Europe is something that I tried to emphasize in the presentation. That is to say, Polska, Rosja, Turcja, wszystko razem, right? The idea that you can put them all together into one Eastern Europe, failing to pay attention to how different they all are, and that you can generalize about them as a unit. That's the piece that I think is clearly both very creative and also fundamentally false.
Well, maybe it's because when you look at the periphery from the center, it's, the periphery tends to look the same, Is it a perspective problem?
So there are always issues of perspective, but remember, when British people look across the channel at France, they see customs that they consider barbaric. And likewise, when the French look across the channel at England, they see customs that they regard as barbaric. And it's possible for problems of perspective to play out in multiple directions, including east looking west, as well as west looking east. I mean, these problems of perspective are totally fascinating for someone who works on the history of culture like myself.
But do you think this image of Western image of Eastern Europe actually influenced what we, Eastern Europeans, thought and still think about ourselves? That is, when you, for example, when you look at the discussions about serfdom in 18th and 19th century in Poland, so one of the very often repeated argument was, okay, people from the West consider it barbaric, so we have to abolish serfdom because, we have to be a really civilized people, like the West, and it's incompatible with serfdom.
I think that is correct, and that Western ideas about what is advanced and what is backwards do play a role in shaping political and social thought in the East as well. And the most notable example of it would be if you looked at 19th century Russia and you looked at the movements that we call the Westernizers and the Slavophiles, right? The Westernizers, and you were just speaking about 19th century Westernizers in Poland as well, are people who to some extent reflect an orientation in which they accept the diagram of backwardness that is laid out in the late 18th century. Whereas Slavophiles are people who reject it absolutely, right? And insist that absolute difference as a priority rather than accepting a hierarchy of customs and social patterns in Europe. I would say that if we were looking at Polish modernizers in the 19th century, I'm not sure you would say that you were looking clearly, and that you could perhaps answer this more specifically than I can, that people who admire all things Western, that is to say, you have people who admire and want to emulate very particular aspects of Britain, people who admire and want to emulate very particular aspects of France. And that I'm not sure that you would say that people absolutely accept the idea of a West-East division.
Well, actually, I think that the Polish modernizers have a very complicated relationship with the West. So they want to emulate them in many important aspects. They want to have a very good opinion. The opinion was very important for them. Reputation was very important to them. But still, there was this image of the West which was considered to be cold, calculating, mercantile, as opposed to, Slavic nations, which are, very warm, family-oriented, traditional, and so on. So, and these were the aspects of local, the stereotype of local culture, which was supposed to be, valuable. And even the modernizers wanted to preserve them somehow. Well, there was very complicated. It was actually a very complicated idea. But I actually used the word more than once. I think you used the word backwardness. Was it a quote or just? Do you think we can still use the word backwardness in a good faith, or is there any absolute, criteria of being backward or underdeveloped? Let's say.
So I showed you the quotation from the Comte de Ségur, who says that when you enter Poland, you feel like you have left Europe entirely.
Yeah, I have the same impression.
If I continue that quotation, do you really have the same impression?
Yeah, of course. You can ask anyone in Poland,
I don't have that impression when I go to Poland. What I would say is that if we were thinking about that quotation, you feel like you're leaving Europe entirely, he continues it by saying, you feel like you have jumped back 10 centuries. So when he says you feel like you've jumped back 10 centuries, what he's struggling with is the concept that he doesn't have yet, which is the concept of backwardness. And the whole discussion about Eastern Europe in the late 18th century, as I understand it, is an attempt to try to understand what you would mean by thinking of a hierarchy of societies and how to put a framework on that discussion. Could you speak of backwardness today? You could speak of backwardness today in a strictly economic sense. If I said to you, gross GDP per capita, right? You could measure a precise hierarchy within Europe and across the world of who was more economic, who was better off economically, and who was worse off economically. And most people would accept that as a plausible hierarchy because most people would like to be better off economically and would rather not be worse off economically. One of the things that's interesting about Ségur in the 18th century, when he says he feels like he's going back 10 centuries, he means that it looks poor, but he doesn't have any way of measuring, right? He's not actually making any economic measurements. There are no economic indicators that are available to him in the 18th century. The whole science of economics, which is the foundation of our modern idea of backwardness, is completely absent. So what's fantastic about the kinds of generalizations that they're making is they're making them based purely on cultural impressions. As I was saying, krajobraz, right? He looks at the landscape, right? He sees lots of trees and not so many people as he travels through Polish forests. And he says, it looks very sad to him. What makes the forest look sad? Is that actually an indication of backwardness? He's grasping for a concept that he doesn't have a word for yet.
So is the Eastern Europe also an aesthetic concept, aesthetic idea?
That's really, really interesting question to think about whether Eastern Europe is an aesthetic concept. So I think that for Herder, say, who I showed you on the screen, his collection of Volkslieder, right? It is an aesthetic concept. That is to say, he believes, right? Herder is someone who, like Rousseau, turns backwardness upside down, right? And argues that in some ways a simpler society has more direct access to higher aesthetic values, and that the folk poetry of an uncorrupted people will be more beautiful than the most elaborate civilized poetry that could be produced in more advanced societies. Herder is the one who says Ukraine will be the new Greece, right, will recover the glory of the ancient world. And it's precisely because he understands Ukraine as being uncorrupted by advanced civilizations. Rousseau, looking at Poland, at the Rzeczpospolitą, also believes that republicanism in Poland has not yet been corrupted by aristocratic courts and absolute monarchies, as in the case of France, and that therefore Poland has an advantage in its political and social system. Of course, as I said, he never went there himself. For him, it's purely theoretical.
Okay, let me pause for a second and address the audience. Yes, there will be possibility to ask questions soon. Będzie można zadawać pytania. Cieszę się, że Państwo wpisujecie pytania na czacie. So a few more questions from me, and then we'll ask you. I'm going to ask you a few questions from the audience. You can you see them, Larry?
I can see the questions.
Okay, so
that's really interesting.
But I'm still going to use my privilege as a person who is interviewing you, and I will ask my own questions.
And I'm enjoying our conversation.
Thank you. Me too. I hope that the audience also likes it and finds it interesting. So my question is about the place of your book. You know, there is a certain optimism, I think, in your book about the place of Eastern Europe in the hierarchy of nations. I think, was it connected with the the emotions which are in this book, the point of view, the certain optimism, historical optimism, which I think it's optimistic. Actually, your book is actually very optimistic. Is there a connection between this and the moment, historical moment in which it was written? Early 1990s, the communism fell, and there are very high hopes that Eastern Europe is going to westernize, to become richer, more democratic, better place to live. And I'm not sure these hopes are still as high today as they were in 25 years ago or 30 years ago. So what's your take on this?
So you're absolutely right, Adam. There's no doubt that this book was written in the optimist spirit of the late 1980s and the early 1990s. I was thinking about this book really at the very beginning of the project in Warsaw in 1988. I was there for a conference about glasnost and Eastern Europe. The late 80s was the glasnost moment, right? It looked like the Soviet Union was being transformed by Gorbachev in important ways. It was clear that would have some important meaning for Eastern Europe. And it was the moment at which people who were interested in Europe began to try to imagine what Europe would be like without an Iron Curtain, right? We haven't spoken of Iron Curtain yet, but of course that was fundamental for my Cold War childhood. And not just my childhood, but my whole education. As an undergraduate student, as a graduate student studying Europe, the idea of Iron Curtain and the division of Europe was absolutely fundamental. So to begin in the late 80s, right, to imagine the possibility of no curtain, the end of those kinds of geopolitical barriers, and then to actually see it happen in 1989 across the region, beginning with that round table in Warsaw. I showed it to you because I still remember how unbelievable it seemed to me at that moment that was happening. That definitely shaped the whole book. I mean, it made me pose the fundamental question in the book: is there something really fundamental about this division of Europe?
That's the question I was going to ask you.
Or can we understand it as being artificial? And if we understand it as artificial, can we then reimagine Europe? Could we reinvent Europe?
But do you think it's artificial? There is no structural, essential difference between Eastern and Western Europe. Do you think there is no difference?
a structural difference.
Well, I mean, in terms of historical development, social structures, and
so, if we were to look at Huntington, we would say that there are certain fundamental religious cultural differences between perhaps the Orthodox world, the Catholic world, the Protestant world, you might say. But those don't actually define Eastern Europe for us. One of the things that is most striking about the 18th century idea of Eastern Europe is that it has no religious basis. It's completely secular. The Eastern Europe that they imagine contains Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, and Muslims. And it's not an issue at all for imagining this as a region. So I would agree that they are, that fundamentally, structurally, we would not see a difference. And I'm just going to respond for a moment to a question in the chat, which is rather provocative. He asks whether it's similar to white supremacy.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, I noticed that too. Yeah, go on.
What I want to say about it is that I always think of, when I think of Eastern Europe and Western Europe, I always think of the famous Malevich suprematist painting, White on White, from the beginning of the 20th century, because racially, no difference at all from one end of Europe to the other. In fact, you cannot tell Europeans apart by their nationality. There are travelers who are trying to figure out, can you really recognize a Russian? Except by his beard, perhaps you could recognize a Russian. But everybody who looks at the question of Eastern Europe, Western Europe in the 18th century comes to the conclusion that the physical difference is at best subliminal, that you can't actually detect it at all. And let me come back to Mozart for one moment here. And again, this is partly meant to be an answer to the question, this provocative question from Mr. Kotwica about white supremacy. In Mozart's opera, Così fan tutte, he has a pair of Italians disguise themselves as Albanians, right? And then become Italians again, right? At the end of the opera, take off their disguises. To express the physical difference between an East European and a Western European, all you need for Mozart is a false mustache, right? And with a false mustache, you can go from being a Western European to an Eastern European. So closely do they resemble each other. Go ahead.
Okay, so there are some very interesting questions in the chat, but let me ask you a question about this optimism. Let's go back a little to this optimistic emotion and underlying in this book. Would you like the same book today? Do you still have this optimism today? If you were to write this book today, would it be the same, or in tone, in emotion, or different?
So I would, I was very young when I wrote that book. I've shown you, I'm a child of the Cold War. I was born in 1957. I was 30 when I started thinking about that book. So, and now I'm 63. So yeah, I would do everything differently 30, years later. If I were thinking about the tone, I would probably be, just as you say, a little more cautious about the ways in which I imagined that you could reinvent a continent, right? Because it's hard work to reinvent a continent, and there are many forces that make it hard to change. And some of the hardest things to change are the things that are in people's heads, right, and are there as a result of culture. The other thing that I would do a little differently is I would probably be a little bit less ironic in the tone that I take towards some of those travelers who I write about. I'm sure you notice it when you read the book. But that was a young man's weakness, to want to be ironic about great philosophers of the 18th century. So that tone would probably be different also.
But I like it. It's actually, it makes the reading the book is very enjoyable because of this. Well, part of it because of this irony. Okay, the question from a chat. And do you think Eastern Europeans underappreciate themselves nowadays? I mean, do we have inferiority complex in Eastern Europe, in your opinion? That's my way of understanding this question.
So, I mean, let me go back to what you said before, the question of what I would do differently if I were writing the book today. And the answer, well, the most important answer is I would try to do a little bit more from the Eastern Europeans' side. That is to say, how you felt as an Eastern European in reaction to the kinds of attitudes that were being projected from the West. So one of the things that I would say, and this is in response to the question from the chat, is I think it's really hard to generalize and say Eastern Europeans, do they feel inferior? I think that you could pose it a little bit in terms of a backwardness question. That is to say, you could pose the question, do people in some individual country in Eastern Europe wish that they had a higher GDP per capita? And then you could say the answer is probably yes. Do they wish that they had a better functioning political system or a more liberally functioning political system? Some of them probably yes. Some of them probably no. But you want to know something, Adam? I wish that I, as an American, had a better functioning political system right now. I swear to you. And what I mean to tell you is that I don't think it's merely a function of being Eastern European, and I would hesitate to generalize about that. The Lithuanian song that I ended with, Get Up and Dance to Our Eastern European Kind of Funk, right? It was a Eurovision entry in 2010. I don't know if you remember it from that time.
No, I don't really follow Eurovision, but I get your point.
It was meant to be a sort of response, right? Let's feel good about being Eastern European in 2010. And I think that that probably reflects a certain amount of resentment, of ressentiment, a feeling that Westerners are pushing some kind of superior perspective, even within the European Union. But one of the things that I like about that song is it sort of grabs the concept of Eastern Europe and they make it their own, right? And they transform it into something that is positive for them. And that, I think, is an interesting historical thing from the 21st century, that East Europeans can seize the concept of Eastern Europe and use it for themselves. The last thing I would say in response to the question is I think it's pretty rare for people in Eastern Europe to think of themselves as Eastern Europeans. And I'd be curious if you agree with me about this, that most people, in my experience, would identify themselves nationally as Poles, as Hungarians, as Czechs, as Slovaks, Romanians, or Bulgarians, or Albanians, and would be very slow to feel that Eastern European was an important piece of their identity. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, of course. But, you know, there is one more question I have for you, and I think it's a tough one. When you listen to the people who are supporting today's, Polish government, the right-wing intellectuals, so what they say is somehow very similar to what you wrote in your book. I mean, that they feel very often, they say it openly, that the Eastern Europe and Poland, and especially Poland, is somehow negatively, put unfairly described in the Western media and by the Western, in the Western public opinions. It's actually a very important part of the narrative, and I do think that it's when you say you as an author, when you say that there is no real difference between Eastern and Western Europe, there is no, we are all equally, good Europeans. You somehow absolve this narrative. I mean, you somehow make people who are actually, leading us away from the Western standards of government and civilization. I'm going to use this word. And it's a real issue in Poland, I bet you know.
So what I would say about that is that there is, again, I would come back to what I said at the beginning, that there is critical writing about Poland in the 18th century. Voltaire, for instance, is full of contempt for Poland. But he's a great admirer of Catherine the Great in Russia, that's why. Rousseau, quite the contrary, is a great admirer of Poland. He admires the Republic. He believes that Poland's Republican institutions are of a thing of great value and that you could build a sense of nationhood on institutions like those, even if you lose your political independence. So I would say that if you actually look at the record, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, you will find both positive and negative things said about Poland. The people who say, oh, they have always said terrible things about us and are saying terrible things about us all the time, they are usually demagogues who are using that resentment in order to stoke national feeling that will support certain political purposes. Let me tell you a story. And it would be a little bit of a reply to people who say, oh, they're always saying terrible things about Poland in the West. Years ago, I was in Croatia, but this could have happened in any country. I was doing research in Croatia. Somebody asked me, tell us, Professor Wolff, what are they saying about Croatia in America? And I didn't have the heart to answer her because the answer is nothing. Nobody was saying anything about Croatia and probably had said nothing about Croatia in America for months. And so, I mean, the honest truth is that international news is fairly limited, right, all over the world. And the idea that the Western press is full of negative comments about Poland would probably be a great exaggeration of the role that Poland plays in the Western press. Okay,
so we overstate our importance. That's the answer, probably. Well, part of it.
We all do that.
Let me ask you a question from Mr. Tamecki. How does the concept of Eastern Europe developed in the West plays into Pan-Slavism idea born in the East? That's an interesting one.
Yeah, very interesting one. And I think that we can actually say that in some ways the Pan-Slavism idea is one that's born in the East and in the West both. I showed you in the PowerPoint presentation the Herder quotation about Slavische Völker, Slavic peoples. Herder is one of the earliest people in the West to actually generalize about Slavic peoples. There's very limited information available for philosophers in the West to understand the Slavic connection among the different countries where Slavic languages are spoken in the 18th century. The reason I was in Croatia in the late 90s is because Croatia is one of the places where there were intellectuals who were interested in the connection between Slavic language as spoken in Croatia and Slavic language as spoken in the region as a whole. So that you see figures in the world of the 18th century, both in the West and the East, beginning to piece together the idea that there is a linguistic connection that connects the whole eastern part of Europe. And if you were going to say, you said before, is there anything structural that connects Eastern Europe? You would probably say that Slavic language might be one of the things that you would look at. And this is so powerful in certain moments in the 18th century that if you look in the famous French encyclopédie created by Diderot and d'Alembert under Hungary, they will say that it's a Slavic country, even though we know this is absolutely false. They somehow suppose it must be a Slavic country because it lies to the east. I would say that the idea of a Slavic unity is something that people are thinking about for the first time in the West in the 18th century and in the East, and trying to understand what it means as a linguistic concept, which is the way that we would probably understand it today. But people like Herder are interested in generalizing it as an ethnographic and an anthropological concept, and to think about what things Slavs might have in common across the whole domain of Eastern Europe. And of course, this is an idea that will have a political role to play in the 19th century.
Okay, let's have a look at the questions from the audience. The last one from Mr. Kashuba. Do you think that following Westernization, if I understand it, well, let me phrase it differently a little bit. So, do you think Eastern Europe is going to Westernize? It's going to be just a part of, Western Europe, or there will be still a difference in identity, market pronounced the difference in identity and collective, what do you say, imagination? Yeah?
So in terms of the difference in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, the way I understand it, when I was a child, right, Jacques Wynalezienie, right, the difference was very clear for an American kid. Right, Western Europe was, liberal Europe, NATO Europe, Europe of free markets. Eastern Europe was communist Europe, of communist party states and state economies. That seemed pretty clear in the Cold War. In the 90s, and this was something that I only thought about afterwards, after I wrote the book, Eastern Europe still existed in the sense that the governments of Eastern Europe all had something in common. They were all post-communist governments. And as post-communist governments, they were wrestling with similar kinds of problems, social issues, political issues that were the legacy of almost half a century of communism. And those were different problems than the problems that people were wrestling with in Western Europe in the 90s. What I would say in response to Mr. Kashuba is my sense is that the further we go from 1989, the more East and West will resemble each other. We are now one generation out, right? 30 years, we've just marked 30 years since 1989, right? I've been giving lectures about that. You probably have as well, Adam.
Yep.
What I would say is that young people, I now teach students the history of Eastern Europe, and you do too. Students who have no memory of communist Eastern Europe, right?
It's like a second World War for them. It's very far away.
Exactly.
I teach 20-year-olds, and it's like, I was listening to the tales about the Second World War in the same way they are listening to the tales about communism in Poland. So it's an ancient history for them.
And I think that what their world is shaped by is not just broader European influences, but global influences that come from popular culture, digital media. We're on Facebook now, I think, but Facebook is probably too antiquated for our students, right? Who probably use different social media than the one that we're appearing on now. But the things that are shaping their world are probably very similar to the things that are shaping the world of young people in Western Europe. I think that Erasmus has played a remarkable role in shaping the experience of young people in East and West. And you are going to tell me that I'm being too optimistic again.
I think actually Erasmus is a very allied experience. From the statistics I remember, among Polish students, only 0.4 or 0.6% of Polish university students are actually, they take part in Erasmus exchange. So it's an allied experience, but it's still very important.
So I would see the possibility of some convergence as we move into the 21st century, but to temper that, I don't want you to think that that's a purely optimistic conclusion, because the convergence might be one that we would regard as a bad convergence as well. That is to say, the values on which they converge might not be values that you and I would admire.
Larry, your optimism is really uplifting, especially that right now the right-wing politicians in Poland are discussing basically, Polexit. I mean, Poland leaving, European Union, and it's really not so far away. It's not so far away perspective. So it's really difficult, and the subject of optimism and was coming up. I brought it up so often in this debate because it's really hard to be optimistic. It's really difficult to be optimistic right now in Poland about place in Europe and about the fact we are really part of this real Europe. I mean the real one. Not some eastern wasteland. So that's the reason I was asking you so often about.
I tried to answer as frankly as I could.
Are you optimistic about the future of a region?
Right now, this is a very hard moment to be optimistic. Right, living through the COVID year of 2020, I can't think of living through various political crises, including in my own country. I think it's a hard moment to be optimistic. But one of the things about being a historian, and I've been reminded of this recently, is that you have to take an interest in even the hard and difficult times that you live through, because even if they are unpleasant, as certainly the present COVID moment is, they are historically interesting for those of us who believe that history is important to study.
Okay, one more question from the audience, from Piotrowska, who is a PhD student at St. Andrews, and she's studying female travel writings from Eastern Europe. And Ms. Piotrowska asks a question about female voices between East and West at the time. Would you like to say anything about the subject?
So there were a small number of British women travelers who I wrote about in the book, whose perspectives I thought were very interesting. And Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was one. Lady Elizabeth Craven was another. They were elite women who were traveling in the world of the 18th century, as indeed the men were elite travelers also. Women play some role in the study, and what I think is interesting is the whole question of civilization right? You used the word first, right? But it's an 18th century word, right? The 18th century invents the word civilization, is framed a little bit around the question of how women are treated. Voltaire says in the Essai sur les mœurs that the great difference between West and East, and here he doesn't mean Eastern Europe, but he means Ottoman Empire, which is partly Eastern Europe and partly the Orient, is how women are treated. And women's perspectives are interesting from that point of view. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu goes to Bulgaria on her way to Constantinople, and she goes into the hammam, right? And she sits alongside of women in the hammam and reflects on what the position of women, how women are treated, how women live inside of the Ottoman Empire. And she doesn't reach the very negative conclusion that you might expect. In fact, she comes a little bit to the conclusion that when we are all naked together in the hammam, right, we recognize how close we are and how much we resemble one another. So I think that especially to the extent that gender relations are wrapped up in the way that the word civilization is used in the 18th century. Women's perspectives are very interesting. If you remember the image that I showed you of the woman being beaten in the alongside of the English travelogue, actually that was a French image from the 18th century showing a woman being flogged. It's meant to suggest the particular barbarity of Karachelesny, right, in Russia, is that even women are beaten in such a cruel way. I just wanted to say to Ms. Piotrowska that sounds like a really, really interesting subject to be writing about.
That's I'm certain about that too. And so the question from Mr. Musiał was already answered, I think, so before. But there is also a pretty important question. It might seem not very lighthearted, but it's still important. Was it fun to work on this book? And well, my impression was it was very fun, and there is a feeling, there are some books when you feel that the author it was a dreary work for an author, but it's certainly not this one. It seems like you were having fun writing it.
I was having fun writing it. It was partly that it came at a moment, as you say, of not just historical optimism, but of spectacular historical change, right? We never thought it was going to happen in our lifetimes, right? The kinds of changes that happened between 1989 and 1991 in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So that made it exciting to be working on the project. But also it was exciting to be playing with a problem that, to the best of my knowledge, very few historians had played with before, right? To look at this particular problem of how do you think about the continent being divided, and to discover it playing such an interesting role in the writings of so many famous authors of the 18th century, right? A way of thinking about Mozart, Voltaire, Rousseau, all together in the same project. And I have to tell you, that first image that I started out with that shows you the carte générale, right? La France, l'Empire, la Russie, la Pologne, right? The allegorical map. When I first said that, I said I was, that I was amazed. I couldn't believe it, right? I felt like I was, discovering an artifact from another world, right? That the division of Europe could be so clear in an allegorical image from the middle of the 18th century. I couldn't believe it.
Great, thank you. And I think we already talked for an hour, and I think I would like to ask you one final question, because there are no more questions from the audience, I think. Do you have any book projects right now going on, or do you work on, what do you work on right now?
So I have recently published a book about Woodrow Wilson and Eastern Europe, which is about the reinvention of Europe in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, including the re-establishment of Polish independence. And the book, I think, is being translated into Polish now. And it's very interesting to me for the same reason that I'm interested in figures like Voltaire and Rousseau. And the way because I emphasized in my little presentation that they never went to Eastern Europe. Same thing with Woodrow Wilson. He redraws or contributes to redrawing the whole map of Eastern Europe, but he never goes there, never goes near it himself. It's purely abstract for him, it's purely theoretical, and therefore it's a function of mental mapping, which was one of the things I found very exciting about inventing Eastern Europe, the ways in which maps exist in people's minds. Mm-hmm. And with Wilson, I come to that again at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's something that I've just finished working on, a book that I published at the beginning of this year. What I'm working on now is something very different. It's a project about emperors and empresses, and about a particular opera called Die Frauen der Schatten by Richard Strauss, which is about a mythological emperor and empress. And it has its first performance in 1919, at the very moment that all the emperors and empresses are leaving the stage of history. And I'm writing about the moment at which emperors and empresses depart and they appear on the stage. Right? Yep, they become mythological, theatrical figures instead of political figures.
I'm really looking forward to it, to reading your book. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Larry, for being with us and for answering, some silly questions from me and from the audience. Thank you very much, and dziękuję Państwu bardzo za udział w naszym spotkaniu. Będzie można jednak. Thank you very much. I'm just speaking to the audience for participating in this meeting and asking very, very fine questions. The whole meeting will be recorded, and you can see it. You can rewatch it more than once if you wish. Thank you very much, Larry, and I congratulate you for a great book. It's fantastic. It's very important.
Thank you, Adam. This was a really interesting conversation. Bardzo dziękuję.
Dziękujemy bardzo.